So I'm going to make a start. Welcome everybody to the Institute for Historical Research Digital History Seminar, and in particular to our second postgraduate panel of the academic year. We've been running postgraduate panels since I think about 2017 or 2018, and it's been lovely to see the growth of the panel and the number of postgraduates who want to present each year. Today I'm delighted to, well, I should say I'm James Baker. I'm one of the conveners of the seminar along with Alexandra, who you can see, and some of our colleagues are also in the chat. I am delighted to welcome three speakers today who will each speak for roughly 15 minutes on their individual topics, which, as you'll see, are incredibly diverse and represent the diversity of wonderful research going on in digital history today. We'll have a Q&A towards the end. So please do post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A part of Teams as you go. And if you do want to kind of say your question rather than chat it, rather than just type it out, please do say, and I can unmute you and bring you in at that point. A reminder that the Digital History Seminar has for many years been recording our seminars and posting them to our YouTube channel, where there's an archive of almost 10 years, I think, of seminars that we've got there. So we will be posting an edited version of this at some point this week after the seminar. So if you're particularly excited by some of the research you see here, you can listen back again to what you hear. You can also share it with your colleagues. With the preliminaries done, I will hand over to our speakers for today. I'll introduce them each in turn as we get to their individual talks. So first we're going to have Kelvin Beer-Jones, who we're welcoming back to the seminar as someone who's been with us a few times. Kelvin is currently writing up his PhD thesis in human data archaeology at the University of Birmingham. And Kelvin's a Quaker, he's a gay activist and a retired global industry leader in the energy sector. And they'll be speaking today on the topic of human data archaeology with a focus, I believe, on names and genealogy. So I'll hand over to you, Kelvin, to share what you'd like to share on the screen. And then when you're ready, I will let you get started. And if you massively run over time, I will start waving at you or saying things in the chat.
Thank you for that, James. Can everybody see my slide?
We can.
Good. Okay, then I shall begin. I'm a data scientist interested in past human data, and I'm writing up my PhD thesis with the University of Birmingham. Most current members of the digital humanities family are strongly humanities-based, where the term digital denotes that a historian, for example, uses digital methodologies and technologies to complement what would otherwise be the application of more traditional practices in the School of History. But digital humanities as a discipline is now sufficiently broad, extending well beyond the School of History, and sufficiently mature for practitioners to begin to pay close attention to the nature of past human data itself, what it is, and how it relates to the sources from which it derives. The rapid move to the semantic web invites more and better connected data, and genealogy is a major contributor to the systematic and universal finding, organizing, and managing of human information when it transits from source to data. And yet, genealogy is a poor relation in academia. The scientific study of the interface between the hopefully durable digital world of basic human data and the degrading physical world of sources is here called human data archaeology. Human data archaeologists are concerned to preserve the records of person names and their attributes as they're found in sources at archives and in collections, where, how, and in whatever form they appear. They are concerned with how all records of human names and their attributes are present in sources and then represented or not in the digital world, and the limitations and vulnerabilities of those representations. They are concerned with maintaining the essential but easily broken linkages between each person name found in a source and its representative data items. There can be many, and especially how to preserve those linkages over time. They critically analyze the advantages and limitations when and where sources and data interact, and when human data inevitably must be used as a substitute for its source. Human data archaeologists make significant new scientific and cultural contributions. For instance, when they work to support the development of data infrastructures and technologies that help to find and reveal the many linkages between past human lives at both the individual and collective levels, working across both academic and national boundaries. Human data archaeology encourages the application of semantic web concepts to organize and structure basic data about the human past. For example, by promoting universal authority indexing, the efficient use of persistent identifiers for all representations of human names found in sources, and the use of technologies such as knowledge graphs to help network them. Human data archaeology brings together genealogy and the humanities. It helps traditional humanities researchers to bridge from the world of sources to the world of data, and it extends and deepens the possibilities of customary research. It offers all past human lives as a future data resource to wider academia, including the sciences. A few slides can illustrate a key feature of human data archaeology, the call for a national genealogical authority index. My thesis explores how digital technologies might be used by historians or other researchers to explore the modern era using open source and widely used technologies wherever possible. I looked at the names of persons appearing in the membership lists for a group of societies that the Royal Anthropological Institute in London generally accept as precursors to the formation of the Anthropological Institute in 1871. These societies stretch back some 40 years from 1870 to about 1830. 3,000 names, and amongst them 600 Quakers, were found in the sources, and these you can see represented digitally. They are distributed in a Gephi network graph visualization, clustered around the founding societies. Several persons were found to be members of more than one society, and some of these make small influential networking groups of their own, which you can see here circled. The sources for the member names came from 5 separate archives and in a variety of forms. A widespread problem soon emerged, and it presented major challenges. The loose and variable way in which person names were recorded by authors in the sources. How to translate these multivariant names into a database comprising of one record for each person name became a headache. And this headache is shared by all researchers into past human data. For example, the same name often appears twice in one membership list, as if the same person attended the same meeting twice. A person might be junior in 1830, but senior in 1860. And membership lists were compiled by society secretaries, and so when the secretary changed, the style of name recording in the manuscripts would also change. To resolve this common problem, an authority index was compiled, and at the same time recognizing that the digitally preserving of the original form of the name as it appeared in the sources was important. This is a common problem for all who build datasets where the key identifier is to be a person's name, and each researcher must create their own individual authority index for each database. This practice does not meet FAIR principles because no two authority indexes will be the same, making cross-working by linking research databases uncertain. This family tree is from the index to the Hodgkin family papers held at the Wellcome Institute in London. It shows the genealogical relationships for a key figure in the study, Thomas Hodgkin, MD. It shows that there are indeed 2 John Hodgkins, with John Hodgkin number 2, called Junior until his father's death in 1845, here marked number 1. And there are also 2 Thomas Hodgkins, with Thomas Hodgkin Jr., number 4, the nephew of Thomas Hodgkin, MD, number 3. Given that the purpose of the population study was to find the social networks that connect 3,000 individuals in the UK, and that several historians have already named Thomas Hodgkin MD as a key influencer in network building, understanding the family relationships of Thomas Hodgkin is important. The genealogical record shows that Thomas Hodgkin MD married late and that he had no children. His brother John Jr., on the other hand, married 3 times and had at least 13 children, and they're in the shaded area on the chart. It was Thomas Hodgkin's brother's family that supported Thomas Hodgkin's activism within his family, because it turned out many of them appear as members of the target societies. John Jr., however, is absent from the several histories of the life and activism of Thomas Hodgkin. I hope you can see that genealogy is the best source of help to resolve the common problem of identifying person names that appear in sources in a consistent, rigorous, and comprehensive way. Genealogists, through well-established disciplines and tested techniques, are practiced and adept at the rigorous identification of persons mentioned in sources. And at the heart of the genealogist's methodologies lie the general records, birth, marriage, and death certificates. These provide coordinates to help identify individuals. Father, mother, date of birth, and location are common, and these can help researchers to differentiate and make determinations between the multiple and variable appearances of person names in sources. It is possible, I suppose, that an individual might have 2 birth records, but that likelihood is exceedingly rare indeed. Nonetheless, uncertainty remains, because the past as it appears to us in the sources is incomplete and often frustratingly inconclusive. It is only the authority index that can be formally structured and made universally applicable. But it is still never going to be easy to conclusively identify names appearing in sources in an authority index based on general records. And that's because of the messy data issue. Therefore, the building of a national authority index must allow for individual researchers and genealogists to make and argue their own allocations to the authority index names found in sources. Multiple allocations by researchers and genealogists must be facilitated. Oops, I just jumped 1 slide there. A relational authority index must be a living index. Past human data is messy and has permanent uncertainty, which must be respected, and multiple UUIDs must be facilitated at source. It must be a national index based on genealogy, and that's appropriate both for index building and archive collection coverage in national archives and libraries. And the building blocks to make a GIA actually already exist. And the vision model that I have for this is that of Google Scholar. Most of you will be familiar with Google Scholar, where you can search for an author and the author's published work, and you'll have citations listed. And lots of people can cite that article. In a similar way, in the authority index, different researchers could cite that having seen that person in the index in various sources. And different researchers can challenge those sources. My study of the 3,000 activists in 1820 to 1870 would have been quite different had there been an authority index. FAIR principles, that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, would have been fully implemented. And that's because the research databases could be linked together through one common index, the authority index. Data could have been quickly collected from many archives and databases. I could have used the National Archives, British Library, Bodleian, Wellcome Institute, to name only those that I would have used in the UK. My own research uncovered 10,000 known attributes from the study, and those could have been used by AI to identify even more enriching data found in multiple archives. Rich social network analysis and prosopography need not take years to research. Deep structures and patterns of social interaction will have emerged over the 40-year time span of the study, and past human data would eventually become valuable research data across academia. To conclude, I have a schematic which sets out my vision for an authority index based on genealogy. And I've recently shared this with folks at the National Archives, where I have a fair representative hearing. And the overall message, if there is a branding message that comes from this, is this one, that when it comes to building trees of data analysis and data routes through the past, it is better to plant one tree rather than a whole forest. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kelvin. We will come back to, just as a note to those who are arriving since Kelvin started speaking, that we'll take Q&A at the end after all of our three speakers. Just to note as well to those who've been arriving that you should be able to add in questions into the chat as you go. You should be able to use the reactions, and if you'd like to speak at the end rather than type out your question in the chat or the Q&A, then I'm happy to let you in to do that. But now we will hand over to Leon Hughes, who is a PhD student at Trinity College Dublin, who is researching prisons and the emotional experiences of imprisonment during the French Revolution. He's interested in histories of human and non-human relations, with specific focus on the art de la liberté, as well as developing methodologies for GIS, so mapping systems of different kinds. And they will speak today on the topic of the digital cartographies of protest, relating to French Revolutionary demonstration and experiences of space. So I'll hand over to Leon.
Perfect, thank you very much. Right, let's have a second go at sharing this screen.
And while Leon's sharing his screen, I'll just thank Kelvin for keeping us within time. We're doing well.
Yeah. Right, so you should be able to see that, and then if I do that, you can see it.
It's done a weird thing where it's sort of showing the middle of the slides, not all of it for some reason. Not quite sure why, but maybe
okay.
that's...
I've shared the maybe let me come out and read it. Yeah, okay.
We've got time, don't worry.
Right, okay. So if I now share the full screen, how's that?
That's better.
How's that look?
Much better.
Perfect. All right,
Go
sweet.
for it.
I'll get going then. Okay, so digital cartographies, of protest, rhythms of violent and non-violent demonstrations in revolutionary Paris, summer of 1792. So in the summer of 1792, popular political involvement in Paris was at its height. Festivals and counter-festivals marched across the city, mass sectional meetings took place at all hours of the day, National Guard attroupements gathered at key urban centralities, and petitions and oaths were signed and given by all manner of collective and individual entities. This was a period of dizzyingly dynamic political participation. So how then to find historical tools and methods of representation which can adequately attempt to reconstruct this dynamism in some semblance of coherence? So this project is an experiment in using GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to map the 81 events of non-violent and violent Parisian demonstration between June 1st and September 5th, 1792, identified by Professor Michael Alper in his 2015 monograph, Non-Violence and the French Revolution. This presentation will first explain my methodology before giving a bit of historical context and showing the mapping project, albeit in very brief detail. I will then provide some analysis of the GIS data before concluding on some of its methodological flaws. So this project used ArcGIS Pro to create this base map you can see before you. on top of which all subsequent data sets were laid on top of. So the first layer is the modern street map of Paris, over which is placed a JPEG image of the 1792 Plan Routier de la Ville et Faubourg de Paris. The JPEG is oriented via geolocation, where control points, which are identifiable locations on both maps, are selected, which stretch and move the 1792 map relationally to the modern one. I find it easiest to look at the Seine on the left. You can see it's kind of linked up. So then these two maps have been overlaid with the black lines, which demarcate the jurisdictional boundaries of the Parisian sections, which are 48 local administrative organizations, which coordinated committees and assemblies, often in collaboration with the municipal authorities. And then on top of that, I've added 20 marketplaces, which are in light blue, 8 prisons in purple, and 12 what I've called stationary political centres in green, which is maybe a hackneyed term, and we can discuss that in the Q&A. This is not an exhaustive list, but an attempt to highlight some certain key centralities. Now, these cartographies emerge differently. The sections, marketplaces, and prisons were all asked prospectively from secondary sources, whereas the stationary political centres emerged post facto, as retrospectively certain places became resonant through political engagement. I then created 99 of these base maps, one for each day, June 1st to 6th of September 1792, and mapped the 81 demonstrations, non-violent will be in blue and violent will be in red, that Alpa compiled. On the right, just so you can see how the data was presented to me initially, this is the appendix to his book. So I'm going to start from the 1st of June 1792, but just to give a brief historical survey of the revolution at that point in time. After the initial outburst of popular enthusiasm and hope in the first couple of years of the revolution, in April 1792, the newly elected Legislative Assembly had declared war on Austria. This led to worsening fears of foreign invasion, and with the growing anger at Louis XVI using his royal veto to check radical legislation, popular demonstrations led by the sections was growing in size and strength. So I'm going to click through to the 17th of June. So beginning on the 1st of June, the first 18 days of the summer, aside for a few isolated incidences, were relatively uneventful. However, with Prussia's declaration of war on the 13th of June, pardon, the atmospheric tensions were beginning to rise, which leads me to what I call the first wave, which is 18th of June to the 22nd. So on the 18th, there's a banquet organised on the Champs-Élysées. On the 19th of June, there's a mass meeting by the Section 15-20, when 1,000 people joined. And then on the 20th of June is probably the most famous event, which is the 20th of June Journée, when 30,000 men and women and children from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and Saint-Marcel meet up on the Rue Droite and march into central Paris to the Jacobins and the National Assembly, before breaking into the Tuileries, where the iconic image of Louis XVI wearing the Phrygian cap that you can see at the bottom comes from. This is followed on the 21st of June, when a demonstration from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine is again organised, but only reaches the colonnade of the Louvre. And there's also a reactionary demonstration from Versailles. And then on the 22nd of June, there are continued attroupements in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, but they don't go past the Place de Bastille. After these 5 demonstrations, there is a period of calm in Paris, with a lacuna of demonstrations until the 7th of July. So I'm clicking through right now. And there you go, the 7th of July, when isolated incidents begin again, specifically around the Fête de la Fédération on the 14th of July. That's 11th, there's the 14th, and I will go through to the 21st. However, it's not until late July that tensions begin to rise again, with the proclamation of Le Patron d'Angers on the 22nd of July, which you can see here. It snaked around the city at various public spaces, calling out La Patrie en danger. There are various fédéré deputations and a rise in popular exhibitions of fraternal bonds through oath-taking and street banquets. This begins the second wave of popular demonstrations, which, despite not having to go into much detail, I want to highlight first the rising crescendo of events going on throughout Paris, as well as the increasing violence of the presence of violence, within such events. So I'll click through and I'll stop on the 10th of August. Now, the 10th of August is one of the most important days in the revolution. It's where Louis XVI fun is forced to abdicate. And it features, as you can see here, a true pan-Parisian popular involvement. And that's the first point I want to make, that the scope is huge of this day. The second point I want to make is that the violence that is sweeping through the city, which is relative to the events that have gone before it, quite exceptional. And third, and this is where mapping the days afterwards are important, the after effects of 10th of August happen multiple days after. So here's the 11th, you get funeral corteges and violence still going on, but crucially, deputations are still petitioning the National Assembly. And these multiple deputations, corteges are crisscrossing each other, intermingling and entangling in the dense Parisian urban milieu. And then it's concluded, I would argue, with the transfer of Louis XVI to Le Temple, where he goes from the Tuileries Paris to his prison in the ruined Tower of Le Temple. So the weeks after the second wave were a moment of reprieve, as multiple memorial masses were organised, highlighted by the 26th of August, when a major funerary monument for the deceased of the 10th of August is organised. However, in late August, another wave begins to build in the capital, as various events like the burning of an effigy of Lafayette, Fédéré groups arriving from Brest and Marseille, and popular patrols are organised to hunt for suspected counter-revolutionaries. This led to the 2nd of September, with the announcement of the French defeat at Verdun. This is the infamous September massacres, when 1,200 prisoners were executed by popular tribunals, leading to what Sophie Wanich has called the founding of sovereign vengeance of the people. So the violence here, it begins at the several prisons, l'Abbaye and Caen, and then a little later, a crowd trying to break into Le Temple. And as you can see, it starts to spread throughout Paris, ending on the 6th of September. But if I go back to the 4th of September, what I want to highlight here is, even though there are mass violence going on in Paris, non-violent demonstrations are still ongoing, and they're crisscrossing the events. Their normative political procedure is continuing, essentially. So by mapping these 99 days consecutively, I argue that 3 asymmetric waves of protest emerge, peaking on June 20th, August 10th, and September 2 till 6th, respectively. Historiographically, this is not particularly innovative. These are known events in the revolution. However, where I want to intervene in the historiography is that by using digital mapping to argue that in the revolution, space became a locus and medium of struggle, and that by reconstructing the spatio-temporal rhythms of these protests, that these events were not isolated instances, but part of a larger urban protest crescendo effect, if you will. Urban protests in the summer of 1792 escalated first from predominantly non-violent instances in the residential Parisian localities, and then reached a peak as these local demonstrations directed their protests towards the Parisian political centralities of the National Assembly, Tuileries, or the Palais Royal, where formal legislative and executive power exercised. Most of the deputies lived, and the social production of news was most concentrated. This was then followed by a non-violent de-escalation back into the peripheral localities. This wave model suggests, I believe, close communication networks between different sections and communities within Paris, for as days passed, more and more communities were drawn into the escalating protest. Yet, when one considers the September massacres, these spatio-temporal trends are partially broken as normative centralities are crisscrossed in what could be argued, to quote Lefebvre, a sense of polycentralities. So, I couldn't do this presentation without highlighting some of the methodological flaws of GIS, though, and a lot of it comes from its lack of critical theorization. This particularly in history, I should say, because it comes from the geographical sciences as opposed to the critical humanities, although obviously the critical humanities are catching up. But to highlight a few of these issues, GIS assumes both Euclidean geometries and Boolean yes/no logics. This means that a spatial determinism is imposed from above by the cartographer, and which is the whole point that Lefebvre's trying to make, that space is socially produced, has the potential to be negated. Moreover, this Boolean logic means that the symbology can flatten and distort historical experience in its definite boundaries and monochromacy, hard ontologies of violent and non-violent, and size ambiguities. It gives the impression that everyone in that distinct area is experiencing the event simultaneously. And this misses a huge amount of nuance with crowd composition, but also individuals filtering around the edges, working on their own trajectories or temporalities, which are effective with or against the demonstration, as well as missing the sonic and scopic effects of a crowd, which in the dense Parisian urban milieu was always exceeding its edges, if you will. It also, to go back to the Boolean logics, it has the correlative assumption that where something isn't plotted, nothing is happening, which is obviously not the case. GIS is also notoriously bad at dealing with temporalities, which is one of the reasons why historians have been so loath to deal with it. I've attempted to deal with this dynamism by plotting it day to day, but obviously the hour to hour is then ossified. So I'm going to end with two quotes, one affirmative and the other cautionary, and both were and continue to be central in my use of GIS methodologies. So the first is that GIS is a practice that builds spatial understanding. It's processual and accrues. Through doing GIS, the researcher situates himself and attunes to the spatial conditions of their history. The other, slightly longer, GIS is a, and I quote, practice that builds spatial understanding. The other, a reminder to not see oneself as the top-down Foucauldian eye of power. For, and now I quote, there is not a single spatial history that demands a single digital mapping tool. Rather, there are multiple spatial questions to be asked of a wide variety of sources, which contain different kinds of geographical information. Rather than defaulting to a technological solution, there is a need for critical reflection on when digital mapping is appropriate and when other methods are more suited to both the questions being asked and the sources being examined. I'll leave it there for now. Many thanks for having me, and I look forward to your questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leon, for your rich and generous presentation. I don't think anyone's arrived since you started, so I won't do the same thing I said after Kelvin spoke, but I'll hand straight over instead to Esther, who I'm just double checking Esther's.
Hello.
Is working fine. Good. Yes. Esther is a doctoral researcher at the University of York within the Institute of the Public Understanding of the Past, whose research, which is funded by the White Rose College of Arts and Humanities, is interested in intersections between public history, performance studies, history on screen, and digital humanities. And they'll speak today on the topic of digital dancing, Hamilton, and history on stage and screen, drawing on research that considers the impact of digital technologies on public consumption of historical ideas and knowledge. So when you're ready, Esther, please do share your screen. That's my alarm going off from Leon.
Thank you,
so that was really good. You kept on time. I'll hand over to you when you're ready. Please go.
Lovely. I'm hoping this works. Is that coming through for everybody, that slide?
This time, no. This worked in the rehearsal, but we've got time. So
okay, that's interesting. Let me see if I click slideshow if that makes a difference.
Okay.
Are we getting anything?
No, I can't see anything. It sometimes takes a little time to come through.
Okay. Interview. If absolutely necessary, I will do my best to talk without the.
Well, there's a backup option that I can share it because I have access to it as well.
Okay.
Would that help?
Sorry about this.
It's all right.
I'll have one more go. See if we can get something going.
If you stop sharing and try start sharing again, it might work, but we shall see. If not, I will do it.
No luck?
I can't see it right now, so why don't I try and share for you, and then you can just tell me when to advance the slides. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I've tried to pull it up now, but if it's not working, I don't think it's going to play ball.
Sorry about that. Let me.
Thank you so much. Oh, don't worry.
Can you see that all right? Is that coming through for you?
Something's just loading. Let's have a look. Is it coming through for other people?
Can anyone see my screen being shared?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Oh.
I can see the slideshow, but I can't see you, Esther.
Okay, that's all right. I don't mind if it's just a slideshow. As long as people can see what they need to see.
We can hear
Esther,
you.
why don't you
And hear me.
We can hear you perfectly. So why don't you tell me when to advance the slides, and we'll do it that way. Okay.
Yeah, of course. I actually can't see the slides, James.
Okay. Well, everyone else can. So as long as you know where you are in your script,
okay.
that should work.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'll have a copy myself. Yes, thank you, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's really interesting papers that I'm really excited to be able to contribute something myself towards them. So as was kind of introduced, my paper is entitled Digital Dancing, Hamilton and History on Stage and Screen. So just sharing a few thoughts from my PhD, which sort of thinks more broadly about Hamilton as an example of history and digital cultures and sort of the transmedial conversations that seem to happen in today's public sphere. So if you would like to go to the next slide, which has got should have a paper outline on it.
Done.
Thank you so much. So firstly, it's pretty much, well, about two main sections of this paper. So the first section, I'm going to be introducing Hamilton, talking a little bit about why it's my chosen case study. And then I'm going to go into slightly more detail with one very small aspect of it that comes into my thesis, which is about choreography and movement. Thinking a little bit about Hamilton on stage across different screens and its sort of social media presence as well. Sort of positing whether perhaps movement and choreography could have any sort of metaphorical usefulness for us to understand how ideas are sort of move around in today's contemporary public and digital public sphere. And just to close, I'll think a little bit summarising some of the challenges and opportunities that are perhaps presented by some of these ways of thinking. So if you'd like to go to the next slide for me, please. It should be entitled, What is Hamilton?
We are there.
Lovely, thank you so much. So what is Hamilton? Where did it come from? So I'm not sure how familiar people on this seminar are with Hamilton, but just so that everybody's on the same page. Hamilton is a rap and hip hop musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda. It was originally envisaged as a mixtape. So Miranda had been interested in Hamilton's history and read Chekhov's biography of his life whilst he was on holiday in the sort of early to mid-noughties. The eventual result was a liberal retelling of American revolutionary history, and it came to be heavily endorsed by influential political and economic stakeholders or sponsors, such as the Obama administration, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the Rockefeller Foundation, and Disney. So it went from this idea of let's do a mixtape about this guy's life and the history. It sort of became a Broadway musical. I'll talk a little bit and track through some of its development shortly, and eventually became the sense of global sensation and a big digital trend with several bouts of sort of digital virality across social media platforms. It also has a range of sort of action programs. So it has, for example, its educational program, which uses Lin-Manuel Miranda as a historian and as a sort of methodology and approach for how children can or maybe should learn about history in schools. That's closely associated with the Gilder Lehrman Institution, and also a social justice program, which is called Ham for Progress. So it's a really interesting example of something that is not just history, it's not just a show, it's something with a really very broad presence across the sort of international stage. And importantly for my research, and why it's sort of as part of the seminar, is that Hamilton really has a sense of its own digital culture. It's a musical, it's a soundtrack. It does actually have another mixtape now, which is a collaboration between the original performers and the songs for musical and contemporary pop and rap and hip hop artists, which again, both of which can be streamed. Hamilton's also a film on the Disney Plus network. It's a book, it's a TikTok trend, it's a Twitter or X tweet, it's a digital and a physical archive. So Hamilton's a really interesting transmedial enterprise and space, which is what I think makes it such an interesting example. If I could have the next slide, please.
Yes, done.
It should be, where did it come from?
Yep.
Thank you so much. So in my work, I broadly see Hamilton as tracking through several sorts of phases on its way to becoming what is now this sort of complex transmedial enterprise. We have pre-2015, so this was 2009 when Miranda was invited to perform something at the White House under the new Obama administration that went viral online, but Hamilton, as it now stands, wasn't very much, it was just an idea really. But we had Lin-Manuel Miranda as a really popular person online with a big fan following of his own, so that by the time the show started to be developed off Broadway, it was of no surprise that when we get 2015, the Broadway launch, we have this massive sense of Hamilmania. Hamilton's being talked about everywhere, it's going viral online through hashtags, and you've got this sense of digital virality. We then have a bit of an intermediary phase. We have the original cast members being used to record and produce additional content. In addition to the show, that is, for example, the original cast recordings, which are obviously can be streamed online through Spotify and all major streaming services, but also a cast recording of the original play on Broadway. So Hamilton was never meant to just be a Broadway play. It was always meant to have this wider digital culture around it. It wasn't cinematically released in 2020 as originally envisaged, due to what we now know as the COVID pandemic. We're sort of still living through the reverberations of that very much. So in 2020, you have the Disney Plus film release, and what I seem to term Hamilmania V.20. Once again, we have Hamilton going viral online, a real upsurge in activity with regards to how people are talking about Hamilton and what they're saying about it. This time, it's a little bit different. The novelty isn't so much that this is a rap hip hop musical about a founding father of America, Alexander Hamilton. Actually, it's really about some of the criticism that's coming out. So we get Cancel Hamilton alongside this sort of Black Lives Matter movement, and people are actually looking at Hamilton again and being really quite critical of it. And that was only possible by the Disney Plus film release, and the social media really sort of spurring on this bigger trend. So in my work, I don't particularly mention it in this paper, but I have a data bank of around 1 million tweets before Elon Musk shut the gates of Twitter, and I use various sort of text mining, discourse analyses tools to sort of track some of these trends and see what people are talking about and when. I won't talk too much about that in this paper just because I know we're very pressed for time today, and I'm focusing a little bit more on the sort of other aspects of it. But James, if I could have possibly the next slide.
Yep, done.
Just to sort of hammer home, why is it part of this paper? Why am I talking about Hamilton at all? Well, firstly, I guess really I do feel like it's a really effective entry point into the contemporary public sphere for public historians. I say this with my own background of being in public history throughout my undergraduate, throughout my master's, and then finding this sort of niche as a doctoral researcher. Public history is very much about the place and use of history in contemporary society. How are ideas about the past and its relationship to the present actually being used and engaged with? And that can be, you know, across film, television, policy, education, commemorate extreme. But I find that really Hamilton, just from what I've said so far, really has a lot to contribute to some of those ideas about how the past is being used, its relationship to the present, and that public engagement aspect. Secondly, really it's the extent of Hamilton's own digital culture, but particularly as really what started out as more long-standing storytelling mode with performed theatre. Theatre is thousands of years old, and the ideas of performance and performativity in how we tell stories and share ideas is not new, but the digital dimensions of Hamilton and the scale that it sort of spiraled out at, I do believe it does have something a little bit more novel, a bit more contemporary to it. So I wonder perhaps about Hamilton's potential microcosm of how the uses and place of the past are being really transformed by digital technologies as part of wider digital culture in our 21st century world. But I do want to just briefly allude to the fact that, this is a musical, it's a performing arts-based study, and within sort of public history fields, there's a really rich idea of engaging, with different forms of the past throughout popular culture. But there's very literal actual literature coming out about how some of the more performative and performing arts side of things actually deal with the past. David Dean, a long time ago, pointed out the lack of theatrical consideration, for example, within the Public History Academy. Why is it that theatre scholars and theatre practitioners, for example, spend so much time thinking about history and exploring history and the power of the past and these stories that we tell, relate them to contemporary audiences? But it feels sometimes like historians aren't necessarily doing that back, and public historians. So I'm hoping to contribute to that a little bit through Hamilton as a study. But also, I really like this idea of social media performativity. This is something that is coming out. There's several studies out there, this idea of performance and how we perform in how we communicate in social media. What does that have to say about the things we're saying, the ideas that we're coming up with, history as being enacted perhaps, or in the ways in which we engage with it. So I feel like Hamilton actually has a lot potentially to contribute around the sort of ideas of social media performativity, bearing in mind the extent of Hamilton's own digital culture. There's some potentially really rich interdisciplinary conversations to be had between history, the performing arts, and digital media. And I particularly would like to think a little bit more about maybe some methodological creativity, drawing on some of those more performative aspects as well. So part 2 of today's paper, James, if you could
I've moved
the slide. So I will try to keep this reasonably brief. So my example today is choreography. Choreography as movement is really powerful. There's an embodied narrative mode within and without the performing arts, whether that's day-to-day body language or stage choreography. The ways in which we move and physically act on things have a lot to say about what we do, what we're meaning. And actually, I do have a little bit of a bias here. I do dance and I teach ballet. And I do actually have some related side projects with regards to ballet, performing arts, and history. So just to pop that out there with a little bit of a bias towards the performative. But I do think that it has a really sort of important place within my actual thesis as a way to think about transmedial storytelling, because ultimately the stuff that's being done with Hamilton is both physical and virtual in the sense of its embodiment and its influence. It's really central to Hamilton and the way that it works as a piece of musical theatre. I think it's a really interesting place to think about how digital technologies impact the ways in which storytelling happens, both within and without the physical theatre building. Because ultimately, Hamilton is a show about America's founding father. It's quite a radical, showing the ways, some of these ideas that it's trying to bring across, and the physical aspects of that are really, really important. Blankenbuehler's choreography, was the choreographer. As part of his choreography, he really sees movement as a framing device for the words that are being performed. Movement is really powerful within some of the historiographical work happening on stage. It contributes to public understandings of the American Revolution and the lives of the individuals represented within the show. You can see on these slides here, I have a few pictures of a couple of moments of the show. For the sake of time, I can't show the clips, but also they're not that readily available on YouTube. movement is really central to Hamilton's narrativity in the way that it does its storytelling. The first picture here is from a number called Satisfied, where you see the actors and the individuals essentially reenacting, physically rewinding on stage through choreography to explore the sort of significance of perspective when it comes to historical or individual storytelling, and retelling, whether that's on stage and in the show, but also perhaps as a bit of a comment on how we're telling these stories, what's being told, when and how, from whose perspective. And movement has a really powerful part of that as part of the show. Our second image here is of one of the main characters actually physically burning an archive. There's quite a famous line from the number, which is called Burn, which is let future historians wonder how Eliza, who's the character here, reacted to a particular historical event. And that's because really there is this gap in the archive. We don't actually know a lot of the things surrounding the event. There's a lot of questions, and the choreographer Miranda came together and actually made that physically be represented on stage. It's really powerful to watch. In this third image here, we have, you can see the ensemble. They're actually dressed in what's called parchment beige. They become essentially a physical embodiment on stage of the contemporary fictional public within Hamilton's world, responding and reacting to some of the events and lines that are happening and being depicted physically on stage. But they're also arguably a bit of a representation of the contemporary audience as well, who are watching and engaging with the show, and they sort of lead audiences and publics into how they should maybe respond, what they should think to the sort of scenarios being depicted on stage. So choreography is arguably going beyond just dramatic storytelling. These movements and these moments have something to add to potential public understandings of the past, given the narrative framings of the musical, and throughout, crucially, its various digital disseminations. James, if you could switch to choreography, theatrical stage and theatrical screen.
Done.
There's a few different dimensions here that I want to allude to between seeing Hamilton on stage, but also seeing it as part of the Disney Plus film. In brief, these are liveness, visibility, and control. So within liveness, the show is different within every performance, and this is something that's really hammered home within the book about the production that was released, I believe, in 2016. Fantastic book if you're interested in seeing behind the scenes of how these sorts of shows about the past come together. So although it's consumer in the physical theatre, and technically, I mean, online, everybody could come on a different day with a slightly different perspective in terms of how they engage it. There's a sense of the Hamilton performance and its storytelling being fixed by the digitisation of the Disney Plus film. As much as it's broadened through increased accessibility, it is only one version of the show, and the movement that's happening is also the sense of a physicality. Being in the theatre, seeing documents physically being burned in front of you is really, really powerful and moving moment. You watch it remotely, you've got this boundary between you and the performers, and it isn't a live thing. It's a real difference in the power dynamic. Secondly, visibility. What can you see? What can be followed? This here is on the picture is a typical view that an audience member might have. You can see the whole set, who's moving where at different times. The first level of the show set that you can see there with the balcony, various people come in and out all the time and witness different scenes. It allows you to think, oh, well, what would have happened if they'd seen that? You can't necessarily see the whole stage, though, on Disney Plus show, because the camera and the editing very much controls what you can see and can't see. Really informs and biases your journey as an audience member and your experience of the really a control size and what's not. But I also want to think about this idea of control within sort of platforms and algorithmic influence. And I'm going to try to wrap this up reasonably quickly because I'm conscious of time. So if you could possibly just move along a little bit to the next slide.
Done. And yeah, we are running a little short of time. So
yeah, lovely. This is pretty much my last point here. So choreography and social media theatrics. So I've already said a little bit about this idea of day-to-day performativity, but also social media performativity. I think social media as a digital space has a real sort of interesting sense of movement some potentially actually interesting links with Kelvin's ideas of networking and Leon's sense of movement and embodied action. What is the conversational current for how the contemporary public sphere is happening, the significance of the digital dimensions within this and social media? How are ideas moving and being shaped and influenced in these digital contexts? What might social media space have to say about the place for reinterpreting the past in the contemporary public sphere? So you can see here a little GIF on the left. GIFs are actually one very small example that I do allude to in my research, and they're little snippets of movement, but they're taken completely out of context within the show, and they're used for very different purposes than what's actually intended in the show. You have these really powerful and orchestrated movement moments on stage, really interesting historiographical commentaries going on, and then you get these little GIFs that get splattered throughout social media, and I sort of like to monitor their movement as well and see how they're being used. I see here as well two examples as well in the center and on the right of some of the types of social media content that are being shared about Hamilton. And I wonder perhaps to what extent choreographical staff within all this digital work when the show was in its initial development, did they think, oh, this might get turned into a GIF? How is this going to look on the film? Or were they very much focused on the theatrical stage? But also one question that sort of pops up within my thinking is what extent movement or maybe choreographical understandings might potentially provide useful metaphorical frameworking for exploring how some of these ideas about the past, about performance, are actually moving around the digital sphere to what extent they're developing, how they might relate to sort of social media performance activity. And there's one final slide, if you want to pull that up, but essentially it just summarizes really some of the challenges and opportunities, how do digital trends, current developments, access about the past, how they use and mobilize these ideas in the present. Hamilton's a really future-focused show. History has its eyes on you frequently pops up as a sort of cornerstone lyric, and it sort of begs the question of how we might have our eyes on historical and social change. So what's next? How can historians best wait for it, and the role of digital technologies? And yeah, that pretty much sums up some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to stop sharing so I can see everyone again. Hello. Thank you so much to Kelvin, Leon, Esther for your presentations. It was really lovely to get a sense of the, as I said at the beginning, the kind of the rich tapestry of work that is happening among our postgraduate students under the broad banner of digital history. We now have a little bit of time for questions. I say we've got sort of 10-15 minutes or so for questions. So if you'd like to, as Kelvin and Leon have, turn your cameras back on so we can see you. People in the audience today, please do pop questions in the chat or react in some way so I can let you in to speak. And if there's not an immediate question, I might make a start, take kind of chair's privilege. My questions, I'll start then. So my question is kind of for Leon, but it's a question I think for all of you in a sense. In terms of the kind of units of analysis you're taking, if you could reflect on those a little bit. So you all kind of reflected on the limitations of the work of the kind of platforms you're using, and particularly Leon, you mentioned the limitations of GIS software, which I'm sympathetic to those limitations you mentioned. And I wonder if you could kind of speak to your use of time. Because you mentioned the hour is ossified, for example, because in your kind of work you use the day as a kind of unit of human experience in the walkable city. And I wonder if you could reflect on how that might differ to human experience in the morning or the evening or in the night, and how that kind of use of the day fits with changing understandings of time and temporality in your period, relation to industrial ideas of time, cycles of news reporting, dare I say, ideas of modernity. And before I let you answer, I think the idea of the unit, I think, comes through all of your work. So Kelvin, you're using the kind of the family, I guess, as the unit of connecting people together. And Esther, you're kind of seemingly using, to me at least, using the kind of the theatrical as a kind of unit of understanding of your period, your area of study. So I wonder if you could each reflect on that, starting with Leon, about the kind of idea of the time as a unit, or the day as a unit, sorry.
It was something I struggled with immediately, because I realized, well, immediately, that how was I going to basically break it up, because GIS is a very, I mean, for anyone that hasn't seen it, and to answer the question, it's ArcGIS Pro was the one I used, but there's QGIS is a perfectly serviceable replacement. It works a little bit like Photoshop. You basically have layers that you tag on, as it were, and then you can kind of build your map from there. So I had the layers by day, and you're absolutely bang on, James. The unit was the day, because that was the most serviceable for the time. But if I was ever going to write this into a journal article, it just would fall by 1,000 qualifications. And without going into loads of detail, the easiest way to answer your question is through the night, particularly in the late August. You get a lot of nocturnal patrols, and for anyone that the 18th century, it's Parisian city isn't particularly well lit, so there is a real contemporary fear of the night. There's a lot of literature around it. There's a guy called Récit de la Breton, which publishes his kind of a memoir of 1,000 Nights of Paris, where he's this figure that patrols the streets, as it were. So the night is a real prevalent cultural topic for Parisians at this time. And it was something that I struggled with. In the end, I decided to put all nighttime activity into the day after, because normally the report would come after, and then the social effect, if you will, was then. But it was a haphazard solution, which I think is probably a digital history kind of epigraph, isn't it? But yeah.
Thank you so much. Kelvin, is there anything you have to reflect on around the idea of kind of taking the family as a unit here? You're muted, by the way, sorry.
Some people say I'm better muted, but there we go. Yeah, I can probably pick up a comment in chat at the same time, because it really relates to the same thing. I think it came from my interest in the fact that we have in archives and collections and all over the place actual names and their attributes distributed throughout the data. And in trying to figure out, well, how can we possibly organize and structure this stuff and make good use of it? Genealogy just sprang out as it's a practice that's already in place. It works. So I don't have to prove that genealogy is a valid way of organizing data about names, but it is just only one way of organizing names. It doesn't pick up sort of everything else. But once you have an authority index based on names of family relationships, you can then add attributes to it. So you can add occupations, all sorts of ways of connecting people up. How we do that through Dublin Core, through CIDOC and so on, is a technological issue that I'm sort of opening conversations now with, that those groups to figure that out. And in the chat, one of the commentators said that, I'm perhaps privileged because I'm a Quaker, because Quakers have good records. And once you go back from 1850, it's quite difficult. But the past data is always difficult, and it is always going to be difficult. And one of the points of having an authority index that's flexible and not specified enables us to capture that uncertainty that's in the past data. And that's, I think, my sort of breakthrough contribution, is not to try and hard code, who Joe Bloggs in 1851 is, but to allow everybody in this room to say, well, I think he's somebody, somebody else in this, in this index. But the index is just a way of structuring how to get crawlers to walk through the data and to start to build up, at least an offering of how do we connect them up. And it fits in with the semantic web. I'm thinking about using artificial intelligence here to go whizzing through everybody's archive and come up with a suggestion of who it might be in an authority index. And that's just a help to researchers. It's nothing more than that. It doesn't stop you from doing the hard work yourself to challenge what that sort of linkage is, and to come up with better linkages yourself and add them to the index.
Thanks, Kelvin. And I think the ways in which you talked about the enabling discord, I guess, within how data is represented, and enabling that kind of like multivocality fits with kind of contemporary notions of how cataloging should be done, I guess, as well. I will hand over to Esther, but I should add, Esther, that I guess my question is poor compared to the questions that are in the chat. So please do speak to those questions rather than my kind of question around thinking about, you know, almost in a way my question was like, why did you choose movement when there were so many things to choose from? But are you still there, Esther? We lost you. I think we've lost Esther. Oh no. I think we've lost Esther, unfortunately. Hopefully Esther will rejoin us soon. I wonder if anyone else in the chat and in the audience have any questions. I can't see anyone typing at the moment. If not, can I link back briefly to Kelvin? One of the things that was on my mind, and this does, I think, connect to in some ways, the questions of the chat as well, when you were speaking, is you mentioned national a few times. And I wonder if you could reflect on how organizing data in this way kind of is in tension with kind of shifting ideas of nations, diasporic peoples, patterns of migration, and things like that.
Yeah, good question, James. Again, it's simply been how to simply organize these things. There are national general records available for most countries from around 1850 onwards. So the hope is that this authority index that the UK would build for its citizens would be reproduced in other countries producing authority indexes for their citizens. We always have a problem with the citizens who miss, who don't get recorded in the data. That's a problem for somebody else to solve further down the line, I think. I'm trying to go one step at a time. Yeah, it's the most universal way of creating an authority index that there is, bearing in mind that an authority index, to be an authority index, must have these multiple coordinates in order to sort of determine a name. And a birth certificate gives us, as I said, a mother, a father, a place, and a date. So there are 4 coordinates that help to identify this person. And I can think of no other data set that might give that level of that volume and that sort of consistent way of presenting the data.
Thanks, Kelvin. Just as a note here, I've got an email from Esther saying that they've had trouble getting into back into the calls. I think we're going to assume they're not coming back in, unfortunately. But thank you for those who did offer some questions to chat, and I will pass those on to Esther, and hopefully she will be able to get back to you. There's a question earlier on from Michelle about the software that Leon used, and I believe you use QGIS. Is that right, Leon? Just to cover that one off.
I used ArcGIS.
I used ArcGIS.
But Q is a very serviceable replacement.
I'll just stick that in the chat as ArcGIS. And I know there's also, Becca, your question to Esther's about text mining specifically. And I guess the problem with that in a way is that I think what Esther was doing happened before the blockers went on Twitter to stop us being able to scrape tweets the way we used to. But I'm guessing there was some scraping going on using the old Twitter API. I can see James has his hand up. I'll let James in just to speak if I can remember how to do it. Give me a sec. Go on, James. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Are you able to unmute yourself, James? Oh, sorry about that. I don't seem to let James in, unfortunately, to ask a question as I'd hoped. Let me just go into the chat. Oh, can't find the unmute button. That is unfortunate. I think it's somewhere towards the top next to share, but I can't directly unmute you, unfortunately. So
I think James has put something in chat for me.
Okay. It's going to ask question 1. Okay, fine. I'll read a question 1 then. So question 1 is that given that that as yet a national genealogical authority file is not a thing that exists, would you say perhaps the nearest to it we do have at the moment might be Wikidata? So notable people and family search. Are these platforms that can represent some of what you're looking for, or could be populated and built on? Are there things we could be improved on these two platforms, so Wikidata and family search, that might help?
Yes, both Jameses. That I think that's quite right, and that's why I'm trying to say we need to welcome genealogists into the academic camp. We should stop this sense that academia is in one tent and genealogists are in another. The semantic web is really calling for the two groups to come together. I've worked extensively with a genealogist in the work that I did in my research, and it was very, very fruitful. The genealogist not only provided the information that I wanted, but corrected the information that I already had from the archives and suggested other ways of structuring the data too. So it's a very powerful linkage, and it's a linkage that we have to make. The authority index, I've had conversations with Mark Bell at National Archives about the idea of structuring one and how it might be used in their work. I mean, they had a project called Traces Through Time, which some of you may remember, which could be reinvigorated in this way. A partial index, I think, won't do. I think we have to aim for a comprehensive index of some sort. And the smallest level to do that, as I've mentioned before, is at the national level.
Thank you, Kelvin. I'm just seeing if there's any other questions in the chat. That doesn't appear to be. Alexandra, do you have any questions as one of my fellow conveners at this point?
No, but I did have a moment of panic with the mention of family search and the kind of ethical issues that I think come with using family search.
Alexandra went very robotic for me there, unfortunately. Sorry, I muted you. You were talking about the pain of family search, I believe, at that point, Alexandra. So, and then you turned to a robot, which I muted you for.
Oh, sorry, connection gone.
There we go. We're having good tech tonight, aren't we? Before we conclude then, I'm just going to ask Leon another question then I had, which was about, you mentioned towards the end some of the limitations of GIS, and you mentioned also the extent to which in one of your answers about how you know, in a way, some of what you've done kind of wouldn't make it into the article, right? It's like you wouldn't be talking about these things. And it's a question I often ask sort of historians who are doing work with data, but also particularly historians who are using data to create sort of visual representations of different forms that help them with their kind of thinking around a topic area, but it might not be that those kind of thinking aids actually end up as part of the things we write. And I was really curious about the extent to which you will end up at the end of this kind of PhD you're doing, kind of writing a relatively, shall we say, standard looking history that might be underpinned by a series of choices about data which you might talk about in footnotes or appendices, but actually might not form part of that narrative construction of history that you are producing, or whether or not you are trying to figure out, but have yet to get there, the ways in which some of this kind of really quite rich and interesting ways of thinking about movement through cities might actually make it into the thing you present as part of the thesis or the articles that come out of your work. I wonder if you could just reflect on that for us.
Yeah. So, I mean, the caveat is that this research is not connected to my PhD at all. This was something I did 4 or 5 years ago. However, it was the first research project I ever did, and it has informed everything that's has happened since. I suppose with the form of a PhD, you're just not going to be able to put that level of detail in. Essentially, you can't put 100 appendices, 100 maps in. It is the kind of the failing of the academic form, as it were. You can't, like this, the project can't in its current instantiation be turned into text. So the way to do that is probably to choose certain kind of high points, as it were. But does that then create problems of apogee, or, you know, I mean, the whole point of the rhythmic approach, the crescendo, is to see silence. I mean, you then have that concomitant problem with GIS, because, as I said, with the Boolean yes no logics, but it's important to pause, and that's something that we don't do particularly in the written form. It has to essentially be you know, point after point after point, because the words populate the space. Whereas with GIS, you can stop. And that is a powerful tool for a historian. But I don't think the form, the current form of production, as it were, is going to allow that. So doesn't really answer your question. But it's certainly a line that can be put in an article as a nod to thinking that has happened only because of the methodologies that you've been using. Yeah.
Thanks, Neil. And if Esther was here, though, I will still make the point, we could reflect on her discussion of GIFs or GIFs, and whether they are a way of actually sneaking in some sort of moving visual forms into at least the PDFs of our PhDs or other kind of publications. Kelvin, did you want to briefly follow up on that?
Yeah, I'd like to contribute to that little bit of chat there. I'm trying to remember what I heard Jane Winters speaking recently, but she was announcing that she's launching this year a new style PhD for digital humanities, and it would be based on an engineering PhD, which means that models and modeling are an intrinsic part of the thesis. So I think there's hope to come in the future, but sadly, for those of us who are stuck in the middle of thesis writing at the moment, it won't be much help to us.
Well, thank you for that optimistic reflection towards the end of the seminar. I think we shall draw things to a close. Before we do, I'd like to thank Kelvin, Leon, and Esther all for their wonderful presentations, and for, again, as I said, showing us this rich tapestry of work in the field among our postgraduate students. After we finish the seminar, this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, like I said, so you can go back and look back at the presentations there. And the Digital History Seminar does continue this winter. On the 6th of February, we'll be back at 12:30 in the afternoon for one of our new seminars, which we also did last year, which is a discussion group where we take a text or an idea and spend some time over lunch talking about it. We haven't yet decided what our topic would be, but those of you who dropped into the call just before we started might have noted that we're considering reflecting on Joe Goldie's new book, The Dangerous Art of Text Mining, and some work around that. So we hope to see many of you there, and thank you so much for joining us today.